and welcome to the another in our series of In Conversation with. Today, I'm really pleased to be in conversation with Geoff Felton. If you're part of Mersey Synod, listen to this, you'll know who Geoff is. If you're not, well, you're still welcome. And Geoff is the moderator of Mersey Synod. And we are going to continue conversations thinking about living faith, what it means to be everyday disciples in everyday life. Geoff, hello and welcome.
Hello, Stuart. Good to be with you. You okay?
I'm very well. It's good to have you with us today as we're thinking about this. So obviously you've, as part of a team that's been thinking about this, you've lived with this for quite a while now. So perhaps the first place to start off is just to simply ask you a question. What to you does living faith mean? What does it mean to be an everyday disciple in everyday life?
Thanks, Stuart. That's a great opening question. Straight to the point, going for the jugular, as it were. An everyday disciple. I mean, firstly, you've got to ask the question: what is a disciple? That's the thing. And a disciple is a follower of Jesus, somebody who seeks to live their life as a follower of Jesus, and that for me is not just about it's not just about what I believe in my head, but it's about the way that I express my life. So my relationships with people, how I handle my money, my attitude at work, all those kinds of things thrown in. So it goes beyond just kind of sitting in a Bible study group or a home group on a Tuesday night, and being an everyday disciple is really the 24/7 living out of my desire to seek to follow Jesus. So that's what it is. That's how I interpret that expression.
And I guess that's an answer that's kind of come to you over a number of years. It's not, it wasn't like day one you became a Christian, you thought, oh, I know what being a disciple's all about today. It's something you've learned over a number of years. So can I just take you back in time to, just tell us a little bit about how you came to faith in the first place?
Yeah, that's going back a long way. So back to my teenage years, really. I fell in with a group of friends at school, it was, who kind of dabbled with a local church youth group, and I kind of hung around with them and sort of were a part of that friendship circle. And then while I was with them, something called Mission England happened in 1984, I think it was, which was Billy Graham. Came to Anfield of all places, so I found myself in that strange place, listening to Billy Graham. He kind of made a plea, as it were, or a call to, if you wanted to become a disciple of Jesus, to give your life to Jesus, to come down on the pitch, and someone would meet with you and pray with you. And I was sat on the cop, I remember that, and my mate went, he said, I'm going up. And he looked back to me and he said, are you coming? And I was like, nah, I'm just going to stay here. And I always think at that moment, there was a battle for my soul going on. What was I going to do? This was the moment, where you either kind of take stuff seriously or you kind of walk away. And something within me thought, no, do you know what? I'm going to do it. So I went forward and got prayed for, then got followed up by a local church who their curate was brilliant. He kind of gathered us all, to a group of us together, and kind of opened up his life and his home and that, and just really invested in me. And from there I kind of went off to uni, got involved with Christians at university, and then kind of went on from there, really. So it was really a teenage thing to begin with, and it's sort of gone like that over the years. There are times where you kind of, I was sat there thinking, what's this all about, and how does this work, and that. And university was a really key time for me, because it was when I went, I was exposed to all kinds of different ideologies that I'd never come across before. And I kind of had my Christian faith, and I thought, well, this is what I believe as a Christian. How does that stack up with all these other worldviews and philosophies and ideologies? And I kind of investigated quite a lot of them. It was in the 1980s, so it was in the time of Thatcher's government, and the left, the socialist workers, and that were all quite rampant, as it were, on university campuses. And I kind of investigated them all, and they all had their kind of pros and cons. But the only worldview that for me made a whole sense of things was the Christian faith. So political ideologies they make sense of economics and how to run a government almost like a business, but they don't make sense of relationships or brokenness or loneliness or things like that. Whereas the Christian faith just felt deeper and more personal, and it was answering the questions that I was asking at the time. And as I've gone through life, it's been the same, but I would say it's not always easy to find the answers in the Christian faith. You dig around, and different people may hold different ideas and that, but when you keep coming back to Christ, keep coming back to Jesus, and kind of think, what that old expression, what would Jesus do? It's been something that's kind of sat in my life, in the background, but it's a mantra that I often find kind of going on in my head. What would Jesus do in this situation? So that's my past.
I mean, I guess in a sense, Geoff, but where you find yourself today as a lofty position of moderator of Mersey Synod and United Reformed Church, as a minister in the church, then people expect, I guess, you to be asking those questions. What would Jesus do? How does Jesus shape my life? How does Jesus shape my work? But let's just go back to leaving university. You went into an employment, into kind of what we would call secular life. Tell us a little bit about what you did and how you feel God was using you in that moment.
So all my life, since I was a little boy, I wanted to be a geologist. I was one of these kids that used to pick up rocks and fossils off the beach and come home with a bag load of rubbish, basically, and leave it in my bedroom. But it fascinated me, and that came from one of my early teachers at school. She was a really keen geologist, and she kind of passed it on to me. And so I studied geology at university, and then worked offshore in the North Sea and other places as a geologist. And so that was a very kind of transient life. You'd go away for a couple of weeks, you'd come back for a couple, you'd go away for 10 days, you'd come back for a week, you'd go away for 2 weeks, you'd be back home for 3. You didn't see the same people because you were going to different installations, different rigs and that. And then as I became more established, my routine became a little bit more established. The life on the rigs was a strange place because it was very macho, full of these roughnecks and roustabouts and people that were quite often felt like they were running away from stuff. They were coming offshore to escape from their onshore lives, and family relationships difficult to maintain because of the disruptions of life all the time. Lots of the guys, their relationships with their partners were broken and dysfunctional, and sometimes guys would talk to me about it, and you just kind of sit there and listen and try and sort of help them at times, and I'll be honest, the other big thing on the rigs, there's not a lot else to do, but there was quite a lot of pornography there as well, and that was that was a challenge, and guys used to sit around and watch it all together in the lounges and that. And I just used to take me. I'd be kind of sitting there watching the footy, and then the next thing there was this film would be put on, and I'd kind of take myself off. And a couple of times I had conversations about that. People would say, why aren't you staying, and all that kind of thing. And so there was this sense of trying to be salt and light, I guess, in a place that was difficult and I would say unnatural, because it's not like working on an oil rig is not like a normal community. The guys you work with, you have to trust. You put your trust in that they're going to do their work, they're going to keep things safe, and they're going to do their job well. But at the same time, you're only with them for a couple of weeks, so the depth of your relationship has its limits, I think. So it was. I don't think, for me, it wasn't a very healthy environment. Although, having said that, working on the oil rig is where I kind of discerned my call to ministry. So, God was doing something there,
And so that almost leads to answer a question I was going to kind of follow up with is, how do you feel? Because I assume at that point you were part of a church somewhere still. How do you feel? Do you feel how do you feel? Did you feel that the church kind of supported you and equipped you for living your life as a geologist on an oil rig?
I don't think they consciously did, but I think their stability and their support for my family while I was away was something that I valued. I knew that I'd be going away. Where we lived at the time, we lived down in Hemel Hempstead. We were miles away from our own families who were up in the northwest. So I knew I would go away, and my wife Sarah would be left on her own, far from family. But she had a good church family around, who kind of supported her, invited her to things, checked on her, every now and again, and that. And she had a good community around her, and that was a good example of kind of what church should be from that perspective. Although how they supported me as my own individual life, I'm not sure how I would answer that, but I think they did more than enough to help me in the way that they supported Sarah.
But do you think and I'm not trying to be critical of the church you're part of, but I think there's more of an awareness perhaps today that, did you get a sense that God was using you where you were still on the oil rig, despite how difficult it was, and was the church kind of helping to encourage that?
Do you know what? I'm going to be perfectly honest there, Stu, and the answer to that is no.
Right.
I don't. At the time, I couldn't work out what God was doing, or what God was wanting me to do, or how God was using me. And even on reflection, now I can see kind of glimpses of where God is at work. But I think the thing is, I don't think we always know when God is using us. And I often say to people, I don't think we'll know fully what God has done through us this side of glory.
Yeah.
And we, the important thing for us is to remain faithful in the places we find ourselves, and just let God do the rest. God will do stuff through us that we won't even realise.
I think that's a really important point, because I can what you say resonates as well. I found myself in employment where I was like, I guess a bit like you, I felt a sense of God's call on my life, calling me elsewhere, whilst I was still working within, I'd worked in telecoms and working within that. And the sense of frustration that I didn't feel that this was my purpose for my life. But now I can't actually, just kind of thinking about it now, there's honesty and authenticity in recognizing God's voice just to hang on in there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
To say, it's kind of not yet,
Yeah. yeah,
hang on in there. And, and a bit like you, I'd like to think that God was using me in that moment.
yeah,
Because
yeah,
I'd like to think that God uses us in all our moments.
yeah.
That God's call on our life is beyond what happens on a Sunday morning into all areas of our life, and just to kind of cling on in there. But so what you say really resonates because I think it's difficult
I
at
mean,
times.
yeah, I mean, it's about. I would say, the Christian life is about faithfulness. That's
Mm,
the. If you want, I guess if you think about what do I want on my tombstone, I'd like to think that people would say that he was a faithful follower of Jesus, or something like that. And that for some people that leads, to incredibly spectacular ministries and things. But for most people, it's just a day-to-day recognizing that God is good, that Christ has risen, and just living in that knowledge that, despite the brokenness of the world and what we see around us, that God calls us to be a part of His mission in the world today, which I mean, I remember I was when I was on the oil rigs. As I said earlier, the most important thing for me, that what I ever wanted to do was to be a geologist. That was I'd always wanted to do it from being a little kid, right through school, right through university. That was what I wanted to do. And I became that. God, I believe, kind of gave me the desires of my heart. And I did my geology. And then I remember sitting on my bunk one day on the oil rig. So I was in my early 20s, and I remember thinking, well, this is it. This is what I've always wanted to be. Is this all there is? Is this it now for the next 50 years? And I believe in that moment God said no, that I've got other plans for you, and that's where my own plans began to kind of take a different course. And then I gave up work to go to Bible college just to spend time listening to God and kind of saying, Lord, what do you want me to do, kind of thing. And in that time at Bible college, that's where I believe God used other people to speak into my life and said, I want you to kind of pursue ministry. And so here I am, kind of 26 years later, doing something that I never thought I'd be a minister, and I never thought I'd be a moderator either. So, and I'm here now, and I'm just thinking it's only through Christ that I can do what I'm doing.
I mean, I also think you've really tapped in on some kind of stuff that I like this idea of faithfulness. I like this idea because wherever we are in our life, whether we're in church ministry or ministry in our employment, it's about being faithful to what God's calling to us at that moment. Even sometimes when we can't see what that bigger picture is, where we can't see what the plan and the purpose is, and I think sometimes some of the greatest ministry I've seen has been exercised by people who are working in a shop or in an office block or with their grandchildren or wherever they are in that kind of sense of everyday life. But now your role has changed. You're in a position, this might make you laugh, where you have the potential to shape the direction of the church. And how important do you think it is in today's culture that we remind people that God is using them where they are? Because there does seem to have been a bit of a shift in that kind of narrative.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, you look at, when you read the Bible, you see, God doesn't only use people in the synagogue or the temple. There people are, there's shepherds and carpenters, there's tax collectors and fishermen, there's, all kinds of people that God uses, to bring about God's purposes. I think that where the shift has come, Stuart, is that certainly in our tradition, in the Reformed tradition, there's been a real emphasis on what you know, and
Mm.
getting things right, correct, theologically. And doctrine's really important, and theology is really important. But I think Christian faith is about is about putting that into life, Paul says, doesn't it, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So as our mind is renewed, our lifestyle changes. And then, in Galatians chapter 5, we read about expressing the fruits of the Spirit. Our lives are supposed to bear witness to the person of Jesus. And again, Paul in the book of Romans, he says, offer yourselves as living sacrifices. So, we're to abandon ourselves completely to God. And I think where this is important is that we've shifted from knowing the right stuff to living faithfully, and to having it shaped, in the lives that we lead. That's really, really important, and that's kind of the whole living faith thing. And I think that's what the world looks at the church, and it wants an example. It wants to see a people leading by example, as it were. So the things that we or living by example, the things that we do, should be visible to people, and those things, if we're living faithfully, should reflect, how Christ would have us live and how He would have us to go about our daily lives.
So you've talked about some big things there. You've talked about faithfulness, about transformation, about living sacrificially, about our purpose. So then, kind of in your role as moderator, as a minister within the church, how do you think churches can support people to do that takes them out of the life of what we do on a Sunday morning, as to how we got all the rotas that we need doing for churches filled up? It takes us beyond that to say, actually, our purpose isn't always about what happens on a Sunday morning. It's about what happens in those spaces in between. How do we help support people to do that stuff?
I think, Stuart, I would say, I think it's about relationship. It's about our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. Because the easy thing for me to say is, we need to preach it from the pulpit and teach it in our home groups. But again, that's the mind stuff, isn't it? We need to be, it's not just thinking like Christ, it's living like Christ. And we do that by sharing life together. And I just wonder if at many of our churches, we need to move away from this idea that church is about gathering on a Sunday. So church is about sharing life together and spurring one another on to good deeds, encouraging one another to live. And so, I would like, when churches gather, I'd like more conversation. Not sermons are good, don't get me wrong. I think I love preaching, I love listening to a good sermon. But I just over coffee, at the end of the service or whenever you have it, just some decent conversations about, how's your week going? What have you got planned? How are the grandchildren? How was that time away? Get involved in one another's lives and ask the deeper questions of life. Don't just talk about the weather. So I think for me, I think it's about relationship. In Hebrews it says, doesn't it? Do not give up meeting together. And when the author of Hebrews talked about meeting together, it didn't necessarily mean meeting as the, to have your hymn sandwich kind of thing on Sunday. It was about gathering and building a relationship so that we actually get to know each other, and we know each other deeply, and we learn to trust each other. And then we can kind of help each other. If we've got a difficult meeting at work, or if there's been an argument in the family or something like that, we can encourage one another to think, what would Jesus do in that situation?
Geoff, that's great. Thanks so much today for sharing bits of your life with us, for encouraging us in this conversation, and hopefully as a result of it we can all go out, all of us, to try and to live faithfully, as you encourage us to do, and live as everyday disciples in everyday life. Geoff, thanks for your
Bless
time.
you. Thank you, Stuart. Much appreciated.
Lovely. Thanks now.
Cheers.